All right. Well, happy Friday, everybody, and welcome to another future focused weekly update where I am committed to keeping you 10 steps ahead of what is happening at the intersection of business, technology, and the human experience. If this is your first time checking it out, you can be prepared to hear some of the latest updates and just my perspective on how to navigate them. For those of you who are back watching, I hope you find this valuable. And thanks again for all your feedback, contributions, kind of sending me some different things along the way. Always appreciate that. And if you find this valuable, would you do me a huge favor and share it with somebody, tell somebody about it, give it a review and a rating. It helps others find it and just helps me out. That's the one ask I have. I'm terrible at asking for help. So that is me trying to be more intentional about asking for help from others. And with that, wowzers, there is a lot to talk about. So let me get started. And you know, what's funny before I get into it, I had another one of my mic mishaps where here I recorded the thing yesterday, got it all wrapped up, then realized I forgot to amp up my mic and had to redo it, which thank goodness I did because I actually completely changed the structure. So if you had heard the original version of what I shared compared to what I shared today, I often joke that week by week, I look back at what I post and go, well, I've changed my perspective on that. In this case, less than 24 hours, and I radically changed the direction of this. So let's jump straight into it so that we have enough time. The first one on this is, if you listened to last week's, you heard me share some of my positive attributes and concerns about the big AI companies teaming up with Reddit on content. If you want to hear more about my perspective on why I think it's could be good, and there are good things that can come from it, but also the risks, you can listen to that. I'm not going to repeat all that, but let me just say, well, it did not take long for some of the very active concerns that I had around how are they governing this data and how are they assessing whether the quality of these responses should be included in the responses that AI gives to people's questions and things like that. It did not take long. And all you need to do is go Google some of Gemini or OpenAI's Reddit responses to people's questions. And while I'm laughing a little bit about it, some of them were downright concerning. I've seen screenshots of some of these because, as you can imagine, people are posting them all over the internet, and the big AI companies are scrambling left and right to try and manually take some of these things down because they realized how destructive they were. But I mean, I saw everything from just straight up ridiculousness to one of the ones where, I mean, somebody's just had asked the question, I'm feeling depressed, and it literally said, one Reddit user recommends jumping off the Golden Gate Bridge. And it was just one of these, like, of course, what did you think was going to happen? Anybody who's familiar with Reddit and the kind of content that you can find, are there some legitimate, really good things you can find in there? Yes. Can you find some really positive stuff? Yeah. But there's also a lot of trash. And boy, let me tell you, these GenAI models picked up on the trash and recirculated it like something fierce. So, I don't like to throw in the I told you so's, but boy, there is a bit of satisfaction that comes when you see it. And so I think the big AI companies are going to, and you're going to hear a lot of this episode is focused on safety. And this example over the last 7 days is a perfect example where the companies went, wow, that sounded really good in principle. In practice, this was far, far worse than we ever imagined. Now, the thing that I think is interesting about this one, though, is, and this is where some of the stuff I saw, the reactionary to just these straight out, either ridiculous or downright harmful ones, I'm actually less concerned about those. And granted, I have legitimate concerns about that. Even the one I described where somebody's sharing they're depressed and it says jump off a bridge. I mean, that kind of like blatantly, obviously bad advice type stuff, still harmful if it catches somebody at the right time in the right moment. That kind of stuff, I still feel less concerned about than the more subtle stuff, because that overt stuff, most people can even read that, which is why you see so much all over social media where people just go, are you kidding me? We at least are at a point where there's enough of a divide with some of that, where I'm more concerned with this lack of criteria and data governance and data cleaning that goes into this is when it's more of a subtle difference, where it may not be quite so adverse to what somebody may be thinking, but might be close enough while still wrong. When I think about truth, it's not flat out lies that are usually the most harmful. It's the slight variations in truth that are just enough to get you to believe what is being shared, while at the same time inserting enough misleading or misdirected information to send you down another path. And again, Reddit is loaded with this, but it's not just about Reddit. It has to do, I think what Reddit showed is the lack of data governance. When you scrape the entire internet and just say, hey, well, we don't have time to look and evaluate all this stuff, let's just kind of put it in there and hope AI does well. Clearly, this demonstrates AI does not handle that so well. And I think it just speaks to the fact that we need to see more, and it would just be another caution to people to be very, very, very careful. Now, granted, that's been true before GenAI got big, but it is even more so true as these GenAI models speak to you like another human being and present information in a way that is vastly more influential than just a standard search results response where you end up digging into stuff. So just be careful, folks, with this. And to be fair, one thing I will credit: every single thing I saw, every clipping, every snippet of bad advice from Reddit that GenAI picked up, it did at least cite it. So to give credit where credit's due, they at least have done some work to say, one Reddit user recommended. So at least they're citing this. So hopefully people can use discernment to go, wow, that came from Reddit. Maybe I should do a little extra digging. But again, not everybody has all that context. And I think assuming people have those details, dangerous, dangerous, dangerous stuff. All right, so let's jump into another. I've got another well one for you. So Jan Likey. Anyway, last week I talked about big kerfuffle about OpenAI, and two of their big safety execs departed in a bit of a public way, raised lots of concerns about OpenAI, their commitment to safety. The two execs made quite a noise about, how they were not getting along with the executive team, all this other stuff. And while I shared some of my concerns around this, I also was a little bit skeptical on some of this, where I went, hang on a minute, like, these things are never altruistic. And wouldn't you know it, this week, less than a week later, Jan Likey joins the Anthropic team as their safety leader. Now, you could interpret that on the surface as, OpenAI is not committed to safety, Anthropic is. Or you could say, you know what, maybe things, and I just know how some of these things work, maybe things were in the works long before the public announcement came. So I think rather than place more speculation on, hey, was this just an influence play and, popularity play by Jan, and is this really speaking? I think the thing with it is, it's just more evidence to just be really careful that what you see on the surface, there's usually more going on than meets the eye. And that's exactly what I predicted last week. I said, Jan's going to be fine. Isn't this altruistic? I'm just going down in a blaze of glory to stand up for the rights of people. And granted, there probably is some of that motivated by it, but I knew there was more to the story. So I was not surprised one bit to see Jan either scooped up post Anthropic, but if you know how executive connection stuff works, that deal was in play long before anything went public. So all that to say, just be really careful how quickly you jump to conclusions and condemn certain things based on headlines and stuff like that. Because usually if you just hold your breath and wait a little bit, you'll see more of the story comes to the surface. Now, on the related topic of OpenAI and some of the work they're doing, two big announcements, and this is where I'm transitioning to really the heavy focus on safety, governance, and all of this stuff that's happening. A lot has happened in the last 7 days related to that in the AI space. So the first one is, OpenAI has now gone public. For those of you who've been following the space and are connected into the industry, this won't necessarily be news, but for folks who have been, a little further on the outskirts of it. OpenAI has now made it public that they are training their new model, their next generation, the one that will succeed GPT-4. So if you thought 4.0 was their next big one, it's not. Now, whether it'll be GPT-5, whether they'll come out with some other name, who knows? That's up to the marketing and branding teams to decide. But they've made it public. They are stepping forward in training their next generation. So the tech has reached a point. They're ready to move forward. They're now in the training stages, if you think of product development for these large AI models. But in parallel, and I think some of this was fueled by the big kerfuffle last week over safety with the departure of the two execs. Some of it, I just think, is the company recognizing that this is a major need for them to focus on safety, which you'll hear based on some of the other updates. But OpenAI has also set up its new safety board. So they announced the new training model, or they're training the new model. They also announced they have formalized the new safety board. So it did not take them long to respond to last week's feedback and all that. And like I said, all of this, if you know how corporate politics works, this has been in motion for a lot longer than a week, but now it's all public. So they've got a new board. Sam is on that board. There's a number of board members, a number of other safety and security execs from the company. One of the things that I have some concerns about with this, and I'll talk about this more later, is a lot of these safety boards that I'm seeing in the OpenAI space and just in general, they're all populated with people from within the company. And I often feel that that is a very dangerous place to be, just like self-governance. Oh, I'll govern myself in areas. Well, how good are you really at doing that? And how objectively are you seeing that? So something that we're going to have to watch as I dig into some of these other ones. We'll see how that plays out. There are some moves to do more objective outside lenses in to assess this stuff. But it's a step forward for OpenAI to say, hey, we are still committed to safety. We are still committed to thinking about long-term outcomes. And it ties very nicely to the new model being, into the training stages. The goal of this board is to evaluate and discuss the processes. So when you think about governance and safety, it's not just about what the model can do. It's about all the processes that lead up to creating the model. So they're going to be evaluating the processes and the safeguards. And their plan is they have to come up with something over the next 90 days. So I anticipate we'll see if they take the full 90 days to put something together. I'm going to be watching closely to see what OpenAI does, how they're proceeding with this, where they go, as they start to announce some of the frameworks and criteria they're going to be using to evaluate safety. We'll see if they start pulling in some more external people from the outside. But I think this is an encouragement that at least we're saying OpenAI respond and say, we are committed to safety. We are committed to all of this. And in parallel, we're moving forward with the next gen model, which if you've been following any of the stuff that's coming with some of this next gen stuff, they better darn well be committed to safety, because we are moving into an age where the realities of serious harm to society are real if they're not already here. Now, on that, I want to transition to the next piece, which is I talked a little bit about how we're hearing OpenAI setting up their own internal safety board comprised of board members, other safety members. I think a step in the right direction, far from where I think we need to be. I actually have some images for these next few points. So by all means, if you're not watching, you can check it out on YouTube and you can actually see what I'm pointing at, or you can go look it up and do the research yourself if you'd like. But this next update I have has to do with Stanford. Recently came out, well, they didn't come out with it. They have announced the latest update to this. Stanford put together what's called the Stanford Foundation Model Transparency Index. So really the Model Transparency Index. This was put together by Stanford. To me, this is an encouragement. This is almost like a step ahead of what I just talked about with OpenAI, where Stanford, while they have ties to these companies, I have no doubt that there is money associated with some of this stuff. They would be, in my opinion, what I would consider a more third-party objective advisor on this, who's looking at some of this stuff. And this transparency index was originally established in 2023 in October. And essentially what it was is they looked at the time when they stood this thing up, they looked at 8 of the companies. Now, since that time, there have been 6 new ones added. Now, this shows you a little bit about how fast these AI models are picking up and how much diversity there is in like who actually owns it. So it's not just OpenAI, Google, and Anthropic. We've got Meta, we've got a whole bunch of other ones. But at the time when they stood this up in October, there were 8 that they took into there. And I'm actually going to pull this up here. So what they did, and I'll show it here, they basically broke down transparency and said, hey, how are we actually looking at transparency within these companies and their AI models? And let's actually take a look at all of this. So let's look at their data practices, how they do labor, the model access, capability. I mean, you can see the list if you look at it, the risks, all this other stuff. And let's actually measure this. And I think this is the kind of stuff we need to see more of, especially from an outside third party saying, we are going to establish standard criteria by which we are going to be measuring you against your competitors and things like that. And so really what this one is looking at is how much transparency do we really have into these models? And if you look at this, I'm going to go over to this one. I think the unfortunate part in looking at this, now granted, you might go, I thought you said there were 14 companies in this. There are, but only 8 were originally part of it when they started. So it's been running for 6 months, and they took a benchmark at October of 2023. Then they did a follow-up just this month. And then they said, how have we made progress on this? And if you look at this, let's just say lots of room for improvement. I did the math on this, and the average transparency score across the board was 58. So barely above half, which some of the most notable providers, Anthropic, OpenAI, and Google, being under 50% or right around 50%. So when you think about that, this really speaks into the fact we don't have a whole lot of visibility into how these things are being managed, how they're going back to what I said before, the processes, what's going on with the data, how is it being managed, how is it being integrated, how are these models being assessed for risk, things like that. This transparency index coming out of Stanford highlights the fact we actually, if you're on the outside, don't know a whole lot about it. I think the other thing that we see with the 8 moving from October of last year to May of this year is there has actually been very little movement in this. Now, granted, Big Code ServiceNow and AL21 Labs, I'm not as familiar with their AI, pretty sizable. And actually, Amazon has also been another one that has moved pretty significantly up. I think AI and Big Code, or A12 Labs or AI21 Labs, theirs are the most transparent. I think some of these other ones, we have a lot less transparency, but still not a lot of movement. And I think this is another area of concern that we need greater transparency into this to be able to regulate it. So first of all, one, if we don't have transparency, we're not even able to look at anything to start measuring it. So I'm encouraged that organizations, institutions like Stanford are saying, you know what, this doesn't exist. We're going to create something and we're going to assess this. Now, one of the things that I thought was a little bit discouraging, or that I'd like to see more coming out of this, is I'm flipping back to this other one that actually breaks down the categories of how are they coming up with this score. Now, one of the things, just as you start looking at this, and I've spent some time looking at it, is it's really important to look at the 2 of these in context, because you may look at this and say, well, Meta, they've made an almost 6-point increase in their transparency. But then when you actually look at the criteria and you actually look at Meta, you see that really it's only capabilities, what their models are capable of, that has increased. Everything else has stayed relatively flat, and we don't know that much about it. And so unfortunately, you got to be really careful when you see this stuff, because till you really dig underneath the surface, in fact, like Google, their data practices, we've actually gone down in some of this stuff. So we just need to be really mindful of this. And I think we need to see much more positive movement in this. The other thing that I was not able to find that I think was discouraging about this one in particular is I don't know what the criteria are, and I also don't know how that's being measured. So while we're seeing movement, which is good, it's a start. We're seeing movement. It was benchmarked here. We're seeing movement here, and we're seeing movement in these categories in this way. we still don't necessarily, at least from what I could find, don't know, well, what exactly are you measuring in these and how is that being measured? Now, to be fair, I think there is risk in making all of that knowledge public, because we've seen over the years how that can backlash when people who are ill-equipped or unfamiliar with this data start looking at data and drawing their own conclusions. So I understand wanting to guard this a little bit, but I do think we need to see more transparency, especially as prevalent as these AI models are and how people are using them. Now, looking at all of this, you may, as an average user, go, so like, what does this ultimately mean? And what should I be taking away from this? I think one of the things is we ultimately know very little in the public sphere. If you're not part of these companies, if you're not in a position where you're actually directly involved or part of advisory boards, things like this, you know very little about this. And so be very careful. And I'll say the same thing. I'm involved in some of the advisory boards related to this. And even I will be the first to say, hey, I don't know all the details of this. I share that because it's, be careful what you consume and the actions you take in response to this, because we really know very little about this stuff. And so it can be easy to speculate, write an inflammatory headline or article to blow things up based on pure speculation or maybe a grain of truth. So as a consumer, just be really mindful of that. Be discerning, be wise, be slow to react, things like that. I think one of the other things, as I was talking to some of my peers about this, there was some frustration with, why are we not further along? Why is this not moving in the direction we would? That actually doesn't surprise me. So if you're feeling, frustrated, why can't we get all this information? This is a very difficult space, not only because it's uncharted waters, but two, we're dealing with privately held companies. Even some of the ones that are publicly traded, yes, shareholders have greater insight into the company's operations, but that doesn't necessarily guarantee that they're going to be transparent and open about the inner workings of their IP and their AI models. So as long as that's held behind privately held companies, it's not all that surprising that we see it. Now, is it disappointing? Yes. Should we continue pushing for more visibility, more transparency, more effort being put into this? Absolutely. But again, until we get there, it makes this very, very difficult to regulate. And I think that's why we need to see more effort put into, who are these third parties? What are the standard criteria? We can't have 37 transparency indexes. Otherwise, you're just going to have people gaming the system and go, well, I'm good on this transparency index, so I can dismiss being low on these other ones. And so I think that's one of the things we're going to need to be careful in this stage right now, is because there's nothing. Usually the way the change cycle works is there's a sudden explosion of these things, and there's a whole bunch of them, and you're like, well, which one do I pay attention to? The Stanford one, or this one, or that one? And so I'll be doing my best to stay on top of these and trying to dig into some of this so people can kind of have a feel for what to be looking to. But again, just be really mindful of that, and mindful of the products and the AI models you engage with, because at the end of the day, you really don't know a lot of what you're working with and how what you're putting into these systems, how you're engaging with them, how they're being used. So that's just caution that I would give to everybody. I shared it last week with the whole Reddit thing. Be careful what you post on the internet, because you don't know how it might be used. Well, the same is true with generative AI. Be careful what you're engaging with AI models on, and how much you're sharing and how you're using them, because we know very little about how these AI models are handling it, what the companies are doing with it, all of that. And so, for the time being, my recommendation is just really use an added level of discernment as we move forward. All right. Another one that I wanted to hit on was Google's safety framework, which I thought was an interesting one. So if you go to Google DeepMind, you can dig into this. And this is separate from a transparency index. This one is really more focused on the recognition. And I said this before with OpenAI's next gen model. There is a greater recognition, which I'll get to my next talking point. There's greater recognition that these models have tremendous, tremendous power, and that what they may be able to do may be vastly more risky than we are anticipating. And Google's stepping up to the plate with this by actually creating a safety framework. So I'll pull this one up on stage so you can see it. But they've actually designed a critical capability model with different levels. They are breaking down their model into 4 categories: the autonomy of the model, so essentially its ability to work independently; the biosecurity of it, its ability to interact on a human bio level; cybersecurity, its ability to be assessed by risk, or be used for nefarious purposes. How easy would something like that be able to take, repurpose, and use in nefarious ways? And then the actual machine learning R&D. So they've nailed down these 4 categories. They've established some criteria. I did try and dig into what these different criteria are and how they're measuring them. I actually had a little bit of a difficult time getting into some of the weeds on this. To some degree, I understand why Google's coming out saying, hey, we have a safety framework, but we're also a privately held company, so we're not necessarily going to show you all the cards of how we're assessing that. Not surprising. I would love to see more transparency around this. But essentially, as I dug into this, what this is they are establishing a threshold at which point they're saying, when we determine based on these 4 criteria that there is serious risk to what we're doing, we are creating that threshold early enough, which you can see by the little doodad that I'm showing on the screen. We're building a buffer zone. And once we cross this dotted line and are in this buffer zone, we are going to prioritize a mitigation plan to actually say, hey, we've identified risk. We need to have mitigation plans in place to address risks so that we never get to the dark blue section of this model where we go, this is going to cause severe harm if we don't mitigate it. To me, looking at this, I see this as a step in the right direction. As I tie it into the next bullet point, I think we still have a ways to go. Some of my concerns, as they were for other ones, stand the same. Google is the one putting this out for Gemini. Could this be adopted by other companies? Potentially. They would need to be more transparent in how they're measuring this and how they're, doing all of their measurements along these lines. But again, could it be adopted? Could a similar framework be used with other AI companies to, again, say, we recognize there is a risk that this could cause severe harm to society if it gets to this point? Where is that? I think what we need, though, that still seems to be lacking for this, and this one left me with more questions than answers, is Google is still establishing this. Just like OpenAI's safety board, Google is the one governing this. Who is actually determining where that dotted line is before they cross the safety buffer? Who's determining when it gets to critical capability level? Who's making sure that the person who goes, hey, we're at critical capability, the company doesn't go, yeah, but we're not going to listen to you. Or, you know what, we're just going to send you out the door with a nice little NDA that says you can't talk about this because we don't agree with your assessment of where that is. And I think that's where I have more questions than answers on this one of, do I think it's a step in the right direction for Google to be taking a more proactive approach to identifying danger zones, putting in mitigation plans, having clear documented criteria for this? Absolutely, because if we don't have these kind of standards, governance practices, and data practices in place, then there is no standard. And honestly, as I've been watching this space, one of my biggest concerns has been, historically, I have not seen a lot of standard criteria, measurements, things like this in place. And so it's been a little bit of the blind find the blind going, yeah, I think we're fine. Yeah, you think you're fine based on what? Like, what criteria are you using to do your guts based on how you feel that day, based on, what doomsday podcast you've listened to or what person you've talked to who told you everything's going to be fine? There hasn't been that focus on how do we do that. So like I said, I'm encouraged that we're taking steps in the right direction. At the same time, I think we've got a long ways to go, and things like the Google safety framework need to be taken to a level of objective outsiders who can then assess across the board. So it's not just you're eating your own dog food and of course you think it's fine, because you have nothing else to compare it to. All right. So that's where I am on the Google safety framework. Again, I don't have a whole lot of things because there weren't a whole lot of details, which is why I would say I'm encouraged by the progress, not yet comfortable with where we are today. Now that transitions me to my next safety one, which I think puts a little bit of a ribbon around the whole one. If you've been watching the news at all and seeing any of this, there was a big summit in Seoul, and all of the major AI players got together and said, we need to have a kill switch for our big AI projects. There needs to be a giant red button that if things go south, we can just clunk and hit it and kill this thing. Which, whenever I see headlines like this, I always like to dig beneath the surface and go, what is actually being said underneath all of this? Because there's more to the story than this. And if you hear this and go, oh, whew, I can take a breath now, because Christopher said there's safety frameworks, there's all these things. Hopefully I've highlighted the risks that we still have with that. And the kill switch, you go, great, there's a kill switch. We've at least created an outlet that we can just unplug if it all hits the fan, right? Isn't this wonderful? Let's talk about where this is a good thing and why I'm encouraged by it. And then we'll get to why I still have concerns around this and why I think we have a long ways to go before I will feel comfortable with where we are with this. So the positive, let's focus on the positive. It is pretty incredible to have a large number, all of the major AI players get together on a global level and agree on something. I mean, I feel like we can't get anybody to agree on anything. So getting people from all over the world, like I said before, from privately held companies who are technically all in competition with each other, to come together and go, for the benefit of humanity, can we all at least agree we need a kill switch? I think that's good. I find it encouraging that there is some degree of unity behind the fact we recognize we're dealing with some really, really dangerous stuff, and we need to put mitigation strategies in place, ultimately potentially leading to a kill switch. And that's about where my encouragement ends, in terms of like, yeah, I feel good about that. It's a step in the right direction. Whereas I reflected further on this, I again had some concerns that I think we just, as we're all watching and following this space, need to be asking, need to be pushing for, need to be, driving in conversations is, let's first examine the fact that every leading AI company in the world got together and said, we all acknowledge that what we've built has the potential to do extreme harm to all of humanity. So much so that we should have a kill switch for it. Even though we aren't one united group, can we just all across the board agree this thing is so dangerous, we all need to build in an emergency switch? I think that speaks to anyone out there who goes, I really don't see how ChatGPT is really going to change the world or be that big of a threat. We're not talking about ChatGPT. We're talking about the power of these models and what they can do. And so anybody who doesn't think this is something that should be taken seriously, or something that is really going to dramatically, I was on a show the other day saying, this will be bigger than electricity. This will be bigger than the internet. This will be bigger than anything we've ever seen. And if you aren't at the point where you're going, this is big, and I should be at least paying attention and keeping a very close eye on how all this stuff is moving. Hopefully, a bunch of privately held companies with competing priorities coming together and going, what we've created is so dangerous, we better put in an emergency kill switch. Let's acknowledge the severity and the magnitude of what that is. So I think that we need to be mindful of. The other part that was discouraging that I'd like to see more progress on is when you actually scratch beneath the surface of, when you say kill switch, what do you mean kill switch? Because that can sound on the surface like kill switch, we trash the whole thing. This thing is too volatile. We're going to throw it in the dumpster, never to be seen again. That is not what we mean. That is not what they're talking about when they say kill switch. So again, before you just try and rest easy and go, oh, no big deal, they're going to kill it. If, we'll just unplug the machine if it gets out of hand. That's actually not even what they're committing to. What they're committing to is, Well, if it gets that dangerous, we just won't continue development of it, which to me raises the question, yeah, but what are you going to do with the thing that you've already determined is so dangerous? It has the potential to cause severe harm to humanity. You're just going to not make it worse? Like, it's already there. What do you do with it? It's kind of like nuclear waste. Like, how do you actually dispose of this stuff once it's been created? And I don't think we have a good answer for that. And I'm not surprised that we don't see unity, that everybody goes, hey, if we get to this point, can we just all collectively agree we'll hit the delete button and erase all our files? We're just not going to see that. But I think we need to see more. And I think we should be pushing more to say, how are we actually going to shut this down? And what are our mitigation strategies? It has to be more than, well, we just won't make it worse. That to me is unacceptable. And I think societally, we should say that is an unacceptable answer to that question. I think this brings up a lot of the other concerns I have of, well, but who's measuring this? It's one thing to get a group of people together and say, yeah, we all agree. We promise, hand on my heart, that I'll stop developing this if it reaches critical mass, air quotes. But critical mass is very ethereal, very like whatever, and stop development. It leaves the question, who is going to be assessing and determining these things? And there's been a whole bunch of news coming out from people who work internally that go, we should not be the ones self-assessing. We are not in a position to self-assess on this. We will not catch this stuff. We are fully incentivized to do everything in our power to not stop development, to not stop progress. It cannot be us that goes, no, we promise we'll stop if we go too far. There needs to be something external, and I think everyone needs to be pushing for that. Now, that said, this is where I think we need to be really careful, because if you watched the TikTok investigations or the Facebook investigations by the government, I think we should all universally agree that we've got to do better than we have in the past. I can honestly say I would end up siding with the big tech companies if it was like, well, let's let our legislators be the ones that govern it. People who don't understand how a router in their house does not work should not be the ones objectively analyzing whether the AI models that have been created can cause undue harm to humanity. It's just, we need an objective group of people that have a moral compass, that have enough going on that they can objectively look at this and actually make a determination and have the technical know-how to make a decision and a recommendation. But they also have to have the accountability and authority to make that call and have the companies actually do something with it. So that's why I say this kill switch. I'm encouraged that, again, like many of the other safety measures, we're making steps in the right direction, but we are not there yet. And hang on one. All right. Well, I've not actually had to use this feature in my recording thing where it actually pauses things and lets me do that. So I guess that's the joy of having so many kids that don't understand I'm in the middle of something right now. So sorry for the interruption. Hopefully it feels seamless. But anyway, all this to say, I think we've got a long ways to go. And I will be following this closely. The overall safety to society and to humanity is a huge concern that I have. I, in very many ways, feel like we've got a bit of an out of control train on the tracks right now that I'm encouraged to see we're taking some aggressive steps to do something. I think there's a lot more that can be done. Now, again, as an end user, you may go, what do I do with all of this? I'm not on a board. I'm not even going to be someone who would ever be qualified or eligible to be someone who does this. So how do I, as an individual user, respond to this? You know what? The average person will, I'll acknowledge, yeah, you may have little to say in where all of this goes. But I think, first of all, let me start with, where is your hope grounded? And this is not me trying to convince anybody to adhere to my worldview, but let me tell you right now, all of these steps, all of these things I just described should highlight to everyone that we, for are in a very unique time in history where we have created a technological advancement, and we have either already created it or are very, very, very close to creating something fully capable of destroying us. And I don't say that to incite fear, to make people panic or anything like that. But I think a healthy respect and acknowledgement for the fact that this is where we are. You cannot like it. You can be terrified of it. You cannot care. But ultimately, this is the reality of where we are, and where your hope comes from matters a lot. Because if your hope is in, well, hopefully the tech companies will fix this, I would say you're going to be disappointed. If your hope is in the right president will be elected, or the right legislation will be put in place, or the right regulatory bodies will come into position to take over and get this in the right space, it's not going to happen. It's not. Things are moving way too fast. There is way too much behind this to think that someone else will fix this for me. And so I can tell you right now, I was on a thing the other day and people were like, how can you say you actually are completely cognitive of the fact we have or will soon have created something capable of destroying humanity? And yet you say it with a smile and go, and I'm looking forward to going and spending the next, rest of my day with my kids. And I think it really comes back to, my hope isn't in what anything that's going on in this world is happening, and it's in something bigger than myself and bigger than humanity. But you need to answer that question for yourself. And I would encourage anybody who's not grounded in something really firm, you're going to want to. On a more optimistic note, I think sometimes a lot of this stuff can feel like it's completely out of control and you just have no idea what to do about it. And what I will say is, you actually have a lot more control over this than you may realize, at least today and where we are right now. While you may not have say in what governance model Google or Anthropic decides on, or whether the kill switch actually meets the criteria you would feel comfortable with, or who ends up ultimately regulating these big, dangerous technology weapons that are out there, what you do have control of is how you're going to choose to show up, and what you're going to choose to engage with, and how you're going to start integrating this into your life, and the decisions you're going to hand over, and the different activities, and the way you are going to end up adopting this technology. Now, if you followed me for any period of time, you would know my recommendation is not throw away all your electronics, go build a house in the mountains, and go off the grid. Although even there are days where I'm like, what, that doesn't really sound so bad. I don't think that's realistic. Maybe some of you can do that. And if you can, kudos, and send me an invite. I promise I won't tell where you live, and I'll come visit sometime. But for the vast majority of people, this is an inevitability that's coming. And we're going to see this interact with us even more. And I'm not going to have time to get to it today. But this is going to become part of our everyday life, and not just what we're seeing like the 1990s role play game where we're interacting from a chatbot standpoint. We're going to start to see this injecting itself into every part of our lives. But you have a choice. You have a choice in how you do that. And you have the ability to say, I am going to participate in this, or I'm not, or this is where, and here's where I'm going to draw the line. And I know there's a lot of best practices that I've implemented into my life that help me not get too dependent on this technology. And I think that's what I would encourage everybody to figure out right now is, where do you need to draw those guardrails for yourself? And it's going to look different for you than it is for me, than it is for my wife, than it is for your neighbor, whatever. You're going to need to figure out where are your vulnerabilities, where are the areas that this is going to go too far with you, and figure out what mitigation strategies you're going to put into place, because you don't need to adopt AI into every single aspect of your life. You may benefit from it in some areas, and in other areas it may destroy you. And you're going to need to do that hard work. And I think the worst thing you can do is just idly sit by and say, well, I just don't really want to think about it. I just am going to kind of see what works for me as it goes. Because the reality is, I've talked about a lot of these things, the unintended consequences that may not present themselves in the immediate moment can show up down the road. And if you're not thinking about it now, you will not be prepared to make those decisions when new opportunities present themselves or when new advances in these things pop up and you go, oh, I guess I hadn't really considered how will I use my AI assistant on my iPhone once Apple actually embeds a fully capable AI assistant, not just Siri that can change the temperature in your house and answer basic Google questions, but one who can actually think and process and help you with things. How far are you really willing to go with that? And how much of your own critical thinking and decision making are you willing to delegate to an AI assistant? Those are questions that you have control over the answers, and you have opportunity now while all this stuff is moving to put some time and thought into where you're going to go with it and how you're going to make those decisions. And the very same things that I'm saying these big AI companies need to have, which is criteria, measurements, ways they're going to determine, hey, when do I hit this critical threshold where it's gone too far? You need to be doing the same things. Now, maybe you don't need to publish it through Stanford, but if you haven't taken the time to think through, where in my life is this? Where am I seeing this starting to show up? What does tech dependence look like for me? What kind of behaviors do I not want to see in myself that if I start seeing them, I'm going to go, wait, I don't want to see this in me. And who, just like I'm recommending for the tech companies, who is involved in your life who can speak to you from an outside perspective? Because just like I'm saying, the tech companies are the worst people to be evaluating themselves against this. You're the worst person to be evaluating yourself on whether or not you're adopting this or whether you're becoming too dependent on it. And so, not that you can't play a role, but you can't do it alone. And so if you don't have those people in your life who know you, who see you, who know what's best for you and can at least give you that and can speak truth into you in those tough moments, take the time to find them. You've got the time now. Make the most of it. Make some smart decisions, and we'll all be fine on the other side. So with that, like I said, this is a radically different episode than I originally recorded. That would have just been a 50-minute blank slate. But hopefully you found this helpful. Hopefully it challenged you. Hopefully it helps you feel better prepared for what's to come and maybe spooked you a little bit, but hopefully in a good way that incites change, not fear. And with that, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your weekend. Thanks for all your engagement, and we will see you on the other side.